Brigadier General Theodore Harvey Barrett. He's the one who built the Barrett Ranch. Do you know what Barrett donated to Grant County? Do you know what he gave to a little boy to play with his children? Do you know who his children were? And do you know what annual event was hosted at the ranch? Well, he was commissioned Brigadier General at the end of his 4-year military time because of his faithfulness and meritorious service. The ranch only existed about 57 years, which is kind of sad. Today it's a memory or a legend. My involvement began like 45 years ago when my husband took me past this empty prairie spot and told me about this ranch and this general that had lived there at one time. I felt sad and curious, like, why did it go away? I would love to see it. My second involvement was several years ago. I did an article for the paper on the bell at the Herman School. And so I spent some time at the Grant County Museum going through everything on General Barrett. And when I finished, I felt like I knew him personally. And I had great admiration for him. A few years ago, I was asked to help transcribe some of the letters that he wrote to his future wife, about 60-some letters. Well, I did 2 letters. It took me like 14 days, and I thought I do have other things to do. But it was fun to see the history unfold before my eyes, his words, his letters. And then, what to do with the letters? Well, then it evolved into, well, why not write a play about General Barrett? So this summer in June, Old Settlers Day in Barrett, there will be a play about General Barrett. And we have a team of several people working on that. Our writer is Nick Rippinger. The name of the play is General Barrett's Last Battle. Now you could interpret this, was this his military battle? Was it his life battle? Was it his battle with life and death? You'll have to come and see. He was proud of being a general. Even years later, on certain events, he would wear his uniform. So he was very proud of that. He was one of our most illustrious pioneers. He was 5'7". He had sad, clear, soulful eyes, and he was able to give a clear and forceful address on concerns of the day, such as lowering the freight rates. He was president of the State Farmers Alliance, and he gave a very powerful speech, which will be in the play. There were 60-some letters that he wrote to his future wife on his way from traveling from New York and from Kansas, excuse me. About 60 letters, and these were found in 1960 by a man named Justin Hall in the Twin Cities. He bought them at an estate sale, a suitcase full of these 60 letters. And he didn't know what to do with them. And then someone showed him an article from Grant County about General Barrett, and he thought maybe these letters have some value. So he contacted the museum in Elba Lake, and after some conversations of negotiations of prices, he finally ended up donating them to the museum. And so we have them there. He was also asked to run for governor of Minnesota, but he declined. He liked to be active and helpful, but he really didn't want those big positions. He is known for doing more to secure rates of fair transportation for farm products. He is known for improving the railway terminal facility, and he was for a free market. J.J. Hill was a railroad magnate and a friend of General Barrett's. And one night they had a big discussion in his hotel room in St. Paul, and J.J. Hill was telling General Barrett to back off on this battle about prices. But they did remain friends because J.J. Hill did admire his moral integrity and his magnanimous principles. J.J. Hill was a real person. These are all real people and real events. J.J. Hill was also at our farm and is written about in Gordon's book, Between the Cattails and the Bulrushes. J.J. Hill came out to our farm, and he thought the lawn was so beautiful that it became to be named Lawndale Farm. So that was after J.J. Hill's visit. The great-grandpa Frank Ekberg was friends with J.J. Hill. In turn, maybe he was also friends with General Barrett. because it was all that same time frame and they were all interested in cattle. I'm going to, like a school teacher, pass something around. It's 2 examples of his letters, and you'll see how hard it is to transcribe his writing. One is a love letter, and one was, well, his first letters were like diaries of what he was doing. I thought, this isn't much of a letter to your sweetheart. But the last couple years, he got more romantic. But you can just see how difficult it is to figure out his writing. First of all, I want to introduce to you some of the big donations of General Barrett. That's what really impressed me, was his generosity. And I'd like to think that his wife, Georgie, was also generous, because wouldn't you think they would talk about it and kind of decide these things together a little bit? So this first big donation was the year he was married, 1879, they got married. And his big donation was the bell to the school. It's still sitting inside the school today. So we have remnants of General Barrett throughout our community still here today. This bell was special. It was very high value. It had copper in it. It had special tuning. And it was very unusual to give a donation of that size. And on the bell, it's still inside the school. I just read it the other day. It was from West Troy, New York. General Barrett was from New York, and he ordered it when he was out there. Given to the Herman Public School, and on it he inscribed, "The best education is that which cultivates honesty, self-reliance, modesty, high aspirations, and independent thought." I thought there should be a banner inside the school saying that. Those ideals are still good today. So we see the bell, but the interesting thing was he homeschooled his own children. In 1881 was the year he moved into his home, that it was finished. In 81 and 82, he heard that the Methodists didn't have enough money to put the side wings on the church, and he thought that was very important and architecturally beautiful to do that. So he donated 160 acres to the Methodist Church, which in turn, I imagine they could get the money to build. And so they did add the 2 wings on the Methodist Church, which I'm sure some of you have sat in those wings for funerals or weddings or other occasions. And it had many uses, and after it was built, it was considered the finest church west of the Twin Cities to Breckenridge. So it's a pretty nice church out here. So I have been in Sunday school in those wings. I have taught vacation Bible school. The choir usually sat in the wings. The overflow went to the wings, and so his donations still are visible today. And he also donated to the Baptist church. The interesting thing, he wasn't a member of any church. In 1884, he made another big donation, at least 10 acres, and today's taxes say under 12 acres, but he donated the Lakeside Cemetery. Now, don't we just all have many loved ones out at the Lakeside Cemetery? And I am told by a board member there's room for 2 more generations yet, so we're okay. And General Barrett was on the first board. He wanted to make sure that the land was cleared and it was nice for a cemetery. So he was on the first board. Interestingly, he was not buried at Lakeside, but at Riverside in Illinois, near his parents. So why he chose not to be buried here, I don't know, but he went to Riverside. And then 3 years later, in 1887, the town of Freedom, right over to the east, was renamed Barrett in honor of him. He was in charge of, at one time, of a 40-person surveying crew, and the cook had suggested that they change the name to Barrett. And that was pretty nice because he'd been out of the surveying business for some time. But they applied, put an application into the Postmaster General of the United States, and got the name changed to Barrett. There was a hospital in Barrett. That's where my husband was born. It's still there today. It's a little stucco hospital. And so again, the remnants of General Barrett's. So now, I'd like to introduce you to Georgie, the love of his life. Georgie McKee, and there are earlier documents that have her listed as Georgie Brubaker. So whether her father died and her mother remarried or whatever, but she originally on the birth certificate was Brubaker, but in later years she's always known as Georgie McKee. She had siblings. She had a sister named Lily who became a doctor, died in France. She has a sister Jenny and a brother Henry McKee. She was a social society belle of Washington, D.C. She was the elite of Washington, D.C. She was 20 years younger than General Barrett. And I can relate to this because I'm also 20 years younger than my husband. So I know what commitment that takes. And I suspect it was love at first sight because you don't just marry a man 20 years older. They were married June 1879 in Washington, D.C. She came and she brought the first black servants to be in Grant County. She brought her servants with her from Washington, D.C. But they were soon replaced by who? Well, on the farm they hired young girls from Scandinavian countries, Sweden, and so they replaced the black servants. And how were they replaced? Well, Georgie would go back to Washington, D.C. every so often, so I imagine they could ride back with her and get back to their original roots in D.C. So how did they meet? Well, like I said, I suspect it was love at first sight because this doesn't just happen otherwise. Now, where did they meet? Well, it could have been a PX in Arkansas because her dad outfitted excursions to Oklahoma, and General Barrett did do a surveying excursion to Oklahoma. It could have been at Cape May, New Jersey, or it could have been at a resort town in Maine. And in the play, you will see one of these acted out. She said she was almost born on horseback. She loved to ride horseback, side saddle, and she adjusted to the rural area here very well because of her love of horses. And they had 17 beautiful horses in their barn. And she was also the first white child born at Fort Smith, Arkansas. So she had her beginning in Arkansas. Now, of those letters, I'd like to read some of those letters to you, portions of the letters, because these are his words. In 1877, 2 years before he was married, he wrote, "My dear Miss Georgie, the old and trite proverb, out of sight and out of mind, though no doubt generally true, don't apply to my condition. I expected to find a letter from you on my arrival here and was much disappointed on going to the post office yesterday morning and again last evening to find none. I received a letter postmarked Washington. Hastily tearing it open, I read, 'Dear General.' I said, 'Oh, pshaw. If you had looked into my countenance as I thrust the letter into my pocket without reading, you would have known that I was disappointed again.' In my stay in Philadelphia, it happened that quite a number of my friends and acquaintances were there at the time. Among other things, we visited the old Swede church, built before the times of William Penn. But you don't want to hear of graveyards and tombstones, beg pardon. But I told you nothing about the croquet, the dinners and the teas and the talks, of which kept me off the blues and renewed old days and tired me out completely." At this portion of his life, he started referring to the blues, and I don't know if that's like post-traumatic stress disorder from his 4 years of military battle, or if it's because of an earlier condition he had of malaria, but he so often lapses into the blues. In the evening, we went to hear the other Dr. Collier Robert, but he was not in. In his place was another man. I don't know who, a tolerable talker, but I went to hear Collier. The only good thing at their church that night was the singing of the Lord's Prayer by a lady who rendered it modestly and with a great deal of power. It was new to me, sung, not chanted. Did you ever hear it? Get it and learn it. It is splendid. At Sterling, he had stopped at his parents' place. I found some of my friends busy playing croquet, but my sister was hard at work cleaning house. They had commenced to mow the grounds around the house. Captain Merrill challenged me for a contest of mowing, but I declined. However, he took up his sigh, and he was so awkward that I said, "Let me take it." I worked hard all the forenoon. I had scarcely gotten over it yet. For 3 days I was awful lame. It made me sick, but I went through the grounds that nearly killed me. When I got through, I went in and gave my sister $15 to buy a lawnmower. I was fearfully sick that night, never went to bed at all. The effects of mowing and malaria, he had malaria when he was 3 years old, and it would resurface. But toward morning, I got better, taking quinine, by the way. Then I went back to the hotel and took to reading. You know, I always do that when things go wrong as I get the blues. Today I've been to church with my friend Major Hamilton. We attended the House of Hope Presbyterian. I wish I'd gone back to Washington, if only for a few hours, to see her. It is unfortunate that the cow died. Hope you have in some way served your favorite glass of milk. It is really so much better than coffee. I have stopped drinking coffee. It does me no good. Talk about the hotel being quiet. You ought to see me. Eating is my most marvelous happy duty now. Excuse my rudeness in not saying goodbye to your mother. It was very rude in me, and I beg Mrs. McKee's pardon. Now, I'll see. Isn't it pleasant that I am away? There's nobody to be disagreeable to you, nobody to find fault with you, nobody to conjure up evil things, nobody to quarrel with you, nobody to make you unhappy. He signs it, true friend, T.H. Barrett. A few months later, I've been running a high fever. At first, the outlook from my window was wet and gloomy. We are nearing the Ohio River in a wild, romantic country. Through the clouds, it was a sunrise, splendid as the gates of heaven. Then I thought of my Georgie in the clouds. And in spite of myself, a tear would come when I remembered how I had sometimes wronged her and how gracious and generous she was when she should have hated me. So it must have been quite a complicated relationship. Recalling as a boy of 19 when I had landed at Ballets, I walked back to get my little trunk in which my mother had packed my boy wardrobe. I carried it with difficulty, for I was not strong, and placed it in the boat. The train moved on, crossing Ohio over a magnificent iron bridge. I remember how much areas and exactness we marked out those blocks. He's looking at his past surveying jobs. Where these houses now stood, and how we surveyed and leveled every nook and ravine and hill adjoining. It was a better hamlet, but now it's a thriving town with factories and forges and a cloud of smoke. We come to where my first days of work at engineering were done. A hard day's work. I did not then understand that I, being new to the crew, was also being tested, and that they were doing twice the usual amount of work to see what stuff I was made of. I remember the Scotch church. We had a Sunday, 5 hours, solid service. Now we have come to a deep cut, which I helped to measure. We picked up the mastodon tooth nearly as large as my head here. And it was a good place to stay. It's where I first heard of fresh raspberry butter and so on. The tables were loaded. I remember that hot night. I slept here with my head on the windowsill, trying to get a breath of fresh air. The days before air conditioning. We were riding home on a platform car, and soon the car got beyond our car, but was goofing off. I tried to stop it by placing the leveling rod in front of the wheels, which had not much effect than to crush the rod. It was later that Wilkes, who had been working at the level trying to fix it for an hour, looked up good-naturedly and smiling and said, "If you break another level, I shall charge it to you." At the end, he says, "If you can decipher this, trust you will then be ready to calculate the Egyptian hieroglyphics, but if you cannot read, won't be much loss." 2 years later, when he finally gets a little romantic, "It is raining this morning, and I have ordered a top buggy. Be cheerful and happy. If we two are for each other, who shall be against us? I love you with my heart and soul. I love to be with you when present and think of you when absent. I love you with some misgivings as to the future because of reasons which I have often talked about to you. It is because ingrained in my nature there has been stamped so much to make me unhappy. But I will struggle against all dark shadows. You shall revive me, O Georgie. Do not let me go down into the dark abyss. So you see, I'm a little blue, but I know it will go away when I see you, and love to see you face to face. Kiss me, kiss me." 3 days later, you are in your 24th year now, and I am 44 years. Just the right age for each other. Because the 20 years between us is all bridged over by our enthusiastic and intensely perfect love. I have prided myself on being at home everywhere, anywhere in the wide world. That was before I knew you. Now only when I am with you am I at home. Kiss me, Theo. I would like to introduce the rest of the family. Their oldest son was Theodore, named after the father, but they called him Bob because he had a handicap of a very weak neck. And as a baby, his head would bob around, so they called him Bob. Well, that's not Bob, but we'll move on. So he also couldn't turn his head from side to side. This is not Bob, this is his better-looking brother, sorry. But I don't know if that continued into adulthood or not, but as an infant, that's the way it was, so they called him Bob. He married Anna Sylvester. We don't know where she was from. Orrin Larson had an interview on the radio, which is also online. Orrin Larson, our old jewelry store man in Herman. But he did comment on Bob. He said he was unpredictable, but a good worker. Some examples of being unpredictable. They had a hall on the house, a hall that went out to the pump and the cistern, so you never technically had to go outside for water. And then they moved the water system to inside the house. So his mother was gone one day on a trip, and he tore that hallway down. She was very upset with him. But he said the water was inside the house now, and he had nothing else to do that day. So another impulsive thing was his wife needed voice lessons. So he sold part of the farm and sent her to France for voice lessons. They had 3 children. After the death of his father, he took over the ranch for 3 years. He owned part of the land. And during those 3 years, after his father's death, he imported machinery to sell to farmers, but that did not do well either. His mom remarried, and then he stayed for 3 more years and then left for Montana, where, again, I understand he didn't do very well and ended up going to California. Now, this is the second son, Richard's son. Isn't that a beautiful name, Richard's son? He died in 1959. In my research, I had a note that he was good looking. I didn't think much about it until I found the picture, and I thought, oh my, he is good looking. And someone said he looks like a movie star. He married a local gal, Catherine Lord Spooner, from a prominent family in Morris. Well, she did not like the farm, so they built a house nearby. But they ended up moving to the city, and he ended up becoming a lawyer, possibly in Minneapolis. They had 1 child, but they would come back to the farm in the summer to visit. Now, he had the letters. It was probably at his estate where these letters showed up, so I was just curious, did his mother entrust him with the letters, or did he just think, I should, watch out for these letters? But it was at his estate where the letters showed up. So that is Richard's son. Next is the youngest, Georgiana, named after her mother, Georgiana Brubaker Barrett. So Georgiana has her mother's original last name, Brubaker, as a middle name. And you can see this outgoing, she was called Outgoing, 3 years old, chubby little cheeks, and I love her dress. It was suggested I just do this much of a picture, but I thought her dress was so cute, I wanted the whole picture. And she was described as outgoing. Well, little Georgiana did grow up. To a young lady, and she was told not to visit with the hired help, with the hired girls, but she liked to. She liked to visit with those girls. Her mother didn't like that, and also her mother did not like that she smoked. And she went to Herman or Donnelly nearly every day. It was usually Herman. They had property all the way from Herman to Donnelly, so she was always on her property. And she would go daily. And in Herman, there was a winking stone down near the old drugstore, and where people hung around and socialized, so she liked to hang around there. And that winking stone is still there today and by the Pullman house. And I didn't know that till this past fall when I started hearing about the winking stone. It's still there. And she also liked to ride side saddle like her mother, and she'd often go with Colonel Tazy's daughter. He must have been an important person of the day. And she liked to ride side saddle. She married, some say several times. Some said, Orrin Larson said 7 times, and some places it says 4 times. So anyway, her first marriage was in 1906. She was 20 years old. Her first marriage was to a newspaper publisher, Howard Wheeler. He's a prominent man. But she did marry several more times and ended up in California. dying at the age of 77, and was one time married to Lauren Wilt Fong. So she also had a favorite buggy. It was a yellow buggy, there it is, with rubber tires, so she could make good time in that. And she liked to ride with her feet up on the dashboard, and she loved to ride at breakneck speeds. I got this card from Barrett. My aunt and uncle, oops, not yet. My aunt and uncle, the Frocks, Lila and Paul Frock, had a grocery store back in the 50s or 60s, I guess. And my brother gave me a box of greeting cards, and I found this, and I thought, this just looks like Georgiana in the yellow buggy with the rubber tires. And doesn't she look like she's out for some fun? So next, we'll go back to General Barrett and his life. He was born back in August 1834 in Orangeville, New York. As I said, at the age of 3, he had malaria, maybe from when they were in a swampy southern state. His maternal grandfather, I say grandfather because women couldn't vote in those days, but his paternal grandfather voted for both Washington and Lincoln, and those are the only 2 presidents that were also surveyors, by coincidence. He began to prepare for college at Alexandria Academy, studying sciences and Latin and Greek. And then there's mention that he went to Wyoming Seminary when he was 17 years old. He was a teacher for 4 months, and then ill health terminated that, and also poor health prevented him from going back to college. So he worked 1 year at the Corps of Civil Engineers on construction of the Central Ohio Railroad. Now, it just amazes me. He did this hard work of surveying, going through streams and through woods, all kinds of climate. That's hard work. He went into battle. Again, stressful. But just think how hard teaching is if he couldn't do that. He could not do teaching. In 19, he became a surveyor. He wanted the outdoor life. He thought it would be good for him. He began at Wheelington, Virginia. He worked for government and private parties, and he surveyed for 6 years, from 56 to 62. He came to St. Cloud and St. Paul and St. Cloud. Supposedly he had homes in both, but mostly he was headquartered out of St. Cloud. And for those 6 years, he found Minnesota to be the best land and soil. So he knew where he wanted to end up. He surveyed and platted. I looked up platted today. It means getting dimensions on a map. He platted Alexandria, Breckenridge, Fergus Falls, Sauk Center. And you notice they have wide streets. That was General Barrett that designed those streets. So again, we see evidence of his having been here. He also planned the stagecoach road from St. Cloud to Breckenridge. He also helped an editor at St. Cloud. She was writing anti-slavery articles, and some pro-slavery people kind of mobbed her shop and ruined it, and he helped her get reestablished again. Oh, this is okay. So now he's in the military. He enlisted in St. Cloud. He's from New York, but he enlisted in St. Cloud about the age of 28, so he wasn't the youngest soldier. And he enlisted in the 9th Minnesota Volunteers, along with some Indians and French people. He went to Fort Abercrombie as a 2nd lieutenant, and they fought against the Sioux. The next year, he was a colonel commander for the 1st Missouri Colored Infantry. Yes, I said colored. He was in charge of a colored infantry. And his troops were in Missouri and Louisiana. In Louisiana, his malaria flared up again, and he had to ask for relief. So he became president of a general court-martial in Ohio. When he got his strength back, he went back to his troops, and he was a commander of the Union forces in the last battle of the Civil War. It was the last battle. Unfortunately, it was a month after the war was over, but because of communication, they didn't know about it. So they had this battle at Palmetto Ranch, Texas, and he was stopped by Colonel John Ford. It said, I read online that it referred to General Barrett's spree of destruction. I thought, oh, I don't think he sounded like that, but it said his spree of destruction was halted by Confederates under the Colonel John Ford. And then he continued to the Rio Grande under General Sheridan to watch over the Mexican and French on the border there. And more of the military is also in the play, quite detailed. Nick was quite good about researching the military pieces. Again, he was discharged as Brigadier General in 1866. He went back to Minnesota to survey. So he had 6 years of surveying, 4 years military. He went back for about 12 years of surveying in Minnesota, Canada, Oklahoma, Texas, Dakota, Indian Territory, and later Nebraska. In 1876, he made his big purchase about the land you know about here. He purchased the land in Stevens, Donnelly, Eldorado, Rendsville, and Grant County, Logan, and Maxville. I live in Maxville, and I looked at the map, and I thought, wow, General Barrett had land right over to the west of us. Could have been neighbors at one time. And again, Herman was his headquarters. I thought this was interesting. He personally went by buckboard, surveying tools, and a spade to mark out and purchase his land. So he even surveyed and marked out his own land. Bought it from the St. Paul and Pacific Railroad Company. He bought about 17,000 acres of railroad land. The value was about $66,000, which is a lot of money in those days. He used his proceeds from surveying, bonds, overdue interest, and coupons. And 2 years later, he gave up surveying, but he was called one of the most skillful and conscientious of public land surveyors. He mortgaged 1,400 acres for $30,000 to build a home and some buildings. I wondered how he got the money to do this. Well, he mortgaged some 1,400 acres. He built a 4-story house. Oh. He built a 4-story house while other settlers had sod shanties. So can you imagine the prairie, this magnificent place going up 4 stories with this tower on the top making the 4th story. He lived in a tent for a while it was under construction, and he and his wife in 1881 moved in. He was like midway between Herman and Donnelly, 4 miles either way. In his house, he had a library, and he had a desk, and he had crossed swords on the wall, his cap. There was a fireplace with 6-inch tiles around the fireplace, 6-inch tiles, and on each tile there was a Shakespearean scene. So he did like Shakespeare. He had a collection of Indian artifacts. There were rich draperies, which in the picture looked like velvet. They looked very thick and very velvety. There were 4 marble fireplaces. Some of the construction was some natural materials back from New York. There was that hallway to the cistern and the pump. And in the kitchen, there were pigeonholes for his many papers. So he was all organized. There were 10 porches that reached up to the 2nd floor. So it formed like a balcony on the 2nd floor. They had a breakfast room, pantries. They had 2 wide staircases. And visiting school children loved to slide down the banisters. There was a narrow back staircase for the hired help, and there was a small winding staircase going up to the tower. He used a spyglass up in the tower for 2 reasons. One was to see if his help needed any help, and the other was to see if his help were working appropriately. Up in that tower, many initials were carved. And he had a special horse specifically for riding out checking on his help. In the yard, am I ready for the next one? No. In the yard, his yard was 88 acres. That's quite a lot. There were planted 107 trees by a lake. There were 2 lakes by his house. And there was a circular driveway. Now, one place has said the circular driveway went around the entire house, and one said the circular driveway was in front of the house. So, it's confusing for me to know which was which. But he had 50,000 cuttings of forest trees planted, and on the lawn he had evergreens and flowering shrubs to beautify his home. A man named Mentz Krogan had planted cottonwoods on each corridor. In the basement were the living quarters of the black servants. There was a big wide door on the side of the basement so they could actually drive horses in and bring in produce or fuel. And one time, General Barrett drove in with his horses because it was hailing outside. So that was a nice escape to get in there. There's a stove down the basement with 22 burners. I mean, I've got 4 burners and 2 don't work, so 22 is pretty nice. They said the kids love to play with sailboats on the lake. Well, I'm thinking little sailboats that kids make, but then I saw a picture at the museum, and it was a regular sailboat. Well, they're from the east, so they are used to regular sailboats. So how fun to have a big sailboat on your lake. At mealtime, General would ring the bell. Later, porches were screened in. And later, not regular screens, but copper screens were put on windows and doors by Clarence Andrews, and that was just unheard of in that day. And then later, electricity was installed, I like this, for his wife's comfort. In 1886, that's 5 years after they moved in, considerable grain was stolen by a man walking around with a 1-inch auger. But I'm thinking a 1-inch auger would take a little while to steal some grain. And a year later, he sold some of his land that was unimproved. Like I said, his children did not go to public school. They were homeschooled, and they hired a tutor. Now, one source said the children of the workers attended there, but I'm not thinking there's room for all those children. There was a revolving bookcase with a globe on top and a blackboard. And it was interesting that the general paid a little boy named Frank Kalajic. He was a son of a section agent. He paid him a chicken for playing with his children. And he allowed the siblings to come to homeschool, the siblings of Frank. Yes, he induced him with a chicken for each visit. So little Frank ended up with a nice flock and 1 rooster. The general offered Mary and Frank, Mary must be his sister, to attend school, but they chose to go to the Indian school in Morris. But the general's kids would play at their home, and they were invited back to the ranch to play. Upstairs, there was evidence in one bedroom that it was used as a schoolroom. Upstairs, it is believed he taught his 2 boys himself. There were bookshelves, books, and a desk, so they got some special education. And one did become a lawyer. So then on to the farm. Oh yes, I was just going to point out the heavy drapes over here. Here's a door, and the doors would slide, into the wall like that. And here's a picture of Abraham Lincoln, I believe, because he was a fan of Abraham Lincoln. Now back to the farm, which existed about 57 years. It was a bonanza farm. A bonanza farm depends on good wheat crops and good wheat prices. And there are 2 types of bonanza farms. One is a business-owned, like in Donnelly. Mr. Donnelly did not live and work his farm at Donnelly. He hired someone. And then there's the home farm, like General Barrett. He farmed his bonanza farm himself. I remember hearing about Grandpa Ekberg taking care of land for the Upham estates. So they must have had some land that they had farmed. So the Scandinavian Swedish girls came, and they would marry one of the hired men when a home was built. Some of the early help had names like Bruns, Graf, Erdahl, Madsen, and people have told me they have relatives that also worked there. There were several large bunkhouses, and Ole Madsen and T.H. Barrett planted rows of cottonwoods around each quarter of acre of land, and earlier it mentioned that Men's Krogan also planted cottonwoods. I love cottonwoods. I think they'd be beautiful out in the prairie. And so I read that they had shorthorns. I thought, well, good, I know some more information. They had shorthorns. But then I looked on here, and it said Durham cattle. I thought, oh, no. But then I looked up online, and they're the same thing. And they were developed like 1875 in England, so he was like on the cutting edge. I mean, they were developed in 1875, and he's getting those cattle right out to the farm at the Barrett Ranch. And then I looked and saw Norman horses, so I looked them up. They came from the Provence of Normandy in France, and they were beautiful horses, looked like thoroughbreds. So he had beautiful horses, and he had the best cattle. He had chickens, 88-acre lawn, so he must have bought himself a lawnmower. Okay, he was also known to have a figure-8 racing horse track, a horse track in the shape of a figure-8. And people in the area loved to race their horses, and these horses were known to be fast runners and competitive. So he often hosted these on the 4th of July. I also have a great-grandpa that had such a facility up in Delaware, so maybe they also knew each other. Okay. So, as I said, he hosted the Old Settlers Day. He had the original Old Settlers Reunion, and that is also in the play, depicted in the play. They were known for their hospitality and known for being very warm people. When people came to their home for this event, they were met by the general outside, and the general would say, "The house is at your disposal. Make yourselves at home." How fun to go in the house and make yourself at home. Inside, Georgie and Miss Richards, a very charming niece of the general, would greet them inside. And again, here are all the people on the Old Settlers Day. Again, they had 22 burners, so they had all this food to bring out. This year was 1890. They had 200 guests. So about 10:30, they began the welcome. About 2 p.m., they would eat. And it was a full day of games. They had speakers. They had a full program. They had the sailboats on the pond. They played croquet. And the food came out on the dining room table in the house and outside. And they served coffee and lots of refreshing lemonade. And they also had numerous 4th of July celebrations out there. And we have a person from Herman that went out there for some of these events. And I was pleased to know from Kay Johnson that her grandmother, Teresa Olson, went out there. And some of the events they did was they were allowed to try on George's clothes. So think how fun that was. But looking at Teresa, I see she has some beautiful clothes herself. So it was fun to, again, have a link in history that we know someone that went out there. Moose Island. Moose Island wasn't really a depot, it was only a platform. And you might see ladies in long dresses on the platform with a train down the back and plumes of ostrich in their hats, so they're pretty elegant ladies. There's also a baseball diamond out there. That's why I asked Ann to take me out to the ball game. There was a baseball diamond out there. And there was a post office as part of PV's elevator. And Bill Niemackle was a student who would help when the elevator man was too busy. He would help with the mail. And they got the mail out to the ranch and the employees. It was built near the ranch because of General Barrett's close ties with the railroad. That's why Moose Island was built near there. On the ranch, they had some 20 Olsons working there. So they'd have to read part of the letter to know which Olson it went to. And that got to take a long time. So some of these men took a new last name. They would take their hometown as their last name. We still have a few Olsons around. Now, J.J. Hill was a friend, and he would leave cattle at the ranch. So when the prices were good, they could get them on, load them up, and take them to market. So they would be staying out there. J.J. Hill had a private railroad car and a special siding. J.J. Hill also liked to hunt at Niemackle. And we all know where Niemackle is. He was out there. He especially liked hunting ducks there. At one time, there was a lot of buffalo and moose out at Niemackle, and it is thought that they might have become mired in the mud and died because these bones were kind of easily found. And they would take these bones and ship them by the train, ship them out on train, because they were used for buttons. And also later I read probably bone meal too. In 1930s there was a filling station at Moose Island, but now that is gone. Niemackle land was purchased from Indians. Back to General Barrett. Love at first sight. I suspected love at first sight, but later in his life, it was in research that he did have love at first sight. But it was not a woman, it was a horse. It was a beautiful gray dapple horse by the name of Paulson, and he loved the horse too. But he finally agreed to sell it to the general because he was getting married and he could use extra. And so General Barrett gave him 3 horses in exchange for this beautiful dapple gray horse, which he loved. July 20th, 1900. He was going out to check on one of his workers, and his horse stepped in a gopher hole and threw him. He was 3 weeks in pain, paralyzed, and suffered greatly. At his death, it was a blessed relief. He had a calm face. All traces of suffering were gone. He had a pleasant countenance. He had a private service at his home conducted by the Methodist Church pastor, Reverend T.E. Archer. He used a text from Matthew, "Well done, thou good and faithful servant," as that verse continues. He also commented that General Barrett was faithful, sincere, and dependable. And the pastor commented that General lay like a warrior taking his rest. He was in his uniform. Some other comments about General Barrett. He was strongly averse to display in any way, and so in conformity with his wishes, his funeral was conducted so privately. In the Minneapolis Journal, in the death of General Theodore Barrett, Minnesota has lost one of her most valuable and distinguished citizens. He lived his life for a good and noble purpose. The pastor said he's not dead in the material sense, but he's entered into the joy of the Lord. The general was always everywhere. He was ready to lend a helping hand to any good or worthy cause. Others have said he was one of the most far-seeing men I have ever known in relation of events to the future. All who knew him as a friend loved him. He was the soul of integrity and would not diverge from the path he had marked out. Also, again, that speech he gave. You can continue, Anne. That was beautiful.
Okay.
Also, that speech he gave as the president of the National Farmers Alliance, it was so very effective, and that, again, will be in the play in June at Barrett. He was put on a board casket and put on a platform buggy and taken to Herman on his way to Riverside Cemetery in Illinois to be buried by his parents. He was escorted by his wife, Georgie, his daughter, Georgiana, and his sister, Mrs. Richards. Bonanza farms declined with the rise of taxes. Remember, there's some land sold to Bob. Well, Bob managed that for 3 years. And after 3 years, Georgia remarried to Phineas Barton of Morris. They met at the Moose Island School District. Again, land donated by the general. And Friends had set it up as a basket social. So Friends kind of got them together. And after they married 3 years later, Bob moved to Montana. And 4 years later, Georgia died of anemia. And she was buried in her then husband's family area. It was interesting to note that after she passed away, her husband then insisted they help sit with him at the table and eat. So before that, she kept her distance. You know, the help is the help. But he insisted they eat with him. It mentions one spot that when she left, she took one suitcase. So I'm not sure at what point she was leaving or what was going on, but it said she took only a suitcase and left everything behind. Everything was left behind in the house. Can you imagine leaving your parents' house and just walking away? And so between 37 and 38, 1937 and 38, the rain is coming in, the shingles are not being replaced, the place deteriorates. And the contents were all left behind, even the sword and the uniform. Tiles were stolen. Those Shakespearean tiles were stolen. The house was vandalized. The marble staircase was stolen. Insurance said they had to take it down. So some wood was used for barns and some wood was used for kindling. Farmers hauled it away for kindling. So now we come to June 16th, 1952. Mrs. Mary McNellis Fonda. She holds 2,747 acres and she's selling it now. It's sold in 3 public auctions. And that is the end of this large land holding. This is the final transaction. Erased the last vestige of the Barrett Ranch. Thank you.